Uh, that's a good song to start out a discussion of philosophy. That's Counting Stars by Hum. Classic 90s high school track for me. The Apology, probably the most famous text in the history of philosophy. I can't think of any other text that would be more known, of more reputable note. But this kind of constitutes the beginning of philosophy. The Greek words, of course, philo, sophia, love of wisdom. And the beginning of philosophy, now, technically, yeah, there are what's called pre-Socratic philosophers. These are Ionian region philosophers who predate Socrates and Plato. But generally speaking, the notable first landmark of philosophy is obviously Plato in the Western tradition. And the Apology is Socrates' defense before the Council of Athens. He's on trial for various things. So what we're going to do is go through the dialogue, and I'm going to highlight the interesting points. And the dialogue has some depth, but it's of course not the nothing on the level of, say, what we saw with Phaedo or other dialogues like the Timaeus that we'll get into in other lectures. But the Apology does have some depth. It's again, it's a classic, but it's a little more lighthearted and literary, but lighthearted in a kind of a dark satirical way, because it's of course about Socrates being convicted or charged by the court with so-called crimes. But it does have irony, it has humor in it, and Socrates is a funny guy. He likes to make jokes. He frequently sort of leads his the person he's questioning down a path, and kind of corrals them into the horns of a dilemma for the purpose of illustrating inconsistencies in their thinking to them, so that they become, well, ultimately philosophers. That's kind of what the, like I said before, the gospel or the evangelion of Socrates is to try to get people to think right, which does not fare too well in his day in Athens. So he's brought before the court, and he starts out by talking about truth and that he only cared about what was true. And the first accusation by the council against him is the charge of atheism. The rumor is that he has derided the gods approved by the state, and that he's teaching no gods. The second charge is criminal meddling, and then they also say that he's incited the youth. So he's corrupted the youth, atheism, criminal meddling. But they say that he's corrupted the youth by teaching new gods. So one of the first things he does is point out the contradiction of saying that he's teaching atheism and new gods, because the two don't make sense. If you teach new gods, then you believe in some sort of supernatural. If you believe in supernatural of some sort, you're not teaching atheism. Excuse me. So he says that he kind of gives a defense of his lifestyle. He says, as a philosopher, I never wanted to go after worldly trappings. I wasn't concerned with making bank. I was concerned with what's true. And if I was corrupted, and he kind of appeals to common notions of, most people would think that greed and lust for power and dominance is, bad. Socrates says, what I've, what I've taken this course, if that's what I was after, I wouldn't have done philosophy. I would have, I would have gone into some other means of attaining power and reputation, such as politics. So he mentions politics first, and he says, I'm not a politician because politics seems to exclude the good. It excludes truth, and it excludes the common good, most often for the good of the individual, deceptive, crooked politician. Well, that's true in our day, isn't it? It was true in his day as well. So he says, the first thing that I did as a philosopher was try to figure out who was right. He says, I thought, well, I don't do any of these other trades. I'm not a craftsman. I don't, do these jobs that most people do. I'm not a politician, not an artist or a poet. He says, so what I thought was I should go and ask all of these different, types of trades, these different craftspeople, what the meaning of life and existence is. And he said that to me seemed like the wise approach, because then I could figure out who had the best answer. So he says, I went to a politician first, and everything that the politician said did not appear to be wise, but was in fact just about politics. It was kind of crafted to explain everything according to the model of political machinations. He says, so that didn't sit well with me, because that seemed to be foolish, and the politician that I quizzed over this was resentful. He didn't like the fact that I was questioning him about his view of the world, challenging his worldview. He said, so I thought, well, I still don't know. Politician apparently doesn't seem to know. So I'm going to go ask somebody else. So then he goes and he talks to poets and lyricists. And he asks them, tell me the meaning of life. What's this all about? And he says, they were totally ignorant. He says, so I went to skilled craftsmen. He said, I had no technical qualifications, so I figured them to be wiser than me. But they didn't have answers. So what Socrates says is that it seems like none of these people seem to know. And I didn't claim to know. He said, but when I went to the oracle, he said I took a religious route. I went to the oracle at Delphi. And I asked the oracle, who's the wisest man around? The oracle said, you are. And the reason that he is because he claimed not to know. Now, my take on this is very popular to, I think it's just a popular misconception, to read this as a relativist dialogue, that Socrates is teaching everybody that you can't know anything true, and we should all be epistemological relativists, meaning that we don't have any certain knowledge of anything. Nothing can be known for sure. Everything is opinion. Well, anyone who's read more than one dialogue of Plato knows that that's not true. That's not the Platonic view. The Platonic view very clearly holds to objective absolutes, certainty, so forth. In fact, in the Phaedo discussion, we talked about how absolute beauty, absolute goodness, absolute rightness were all things that were argued for objectively, and there was a good argument presented for those things. But in the popular mind, people who tend to not be very familiar with this or with epistemology or metaphysics, they, kind of like hipster, trendy, hippie-ish type crowds. They like to be, oh yeah, Plato, Socrates taught that you can't know anything. He's the wisest man because he doesn't know. No, he doesn't know. That's the point, is that his unknowing is what led to knowing. So the examined life, famously, from this dialogue, he says, is the only life worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. Because if you haven't examined life and examined meaning and so forth, well, then you're just kind of doing whatever you were programmed to do. You're kind of like a robot, or you're like a rock. Sartre would later call this being for itself and being in itself. He talked about rocks being something like being in itself. It's just kind of there. And then in existentialist philosophy and Sartre, the individual who has self-awareness, who's kind of awakened from the deception, the lie, the matrix, whatever, is the person who is being for itself. Same idea all the way back here to Socrates. So the dialogue is not about relativism or absolute uncertainty. It's about what would be the norm for the Greek tradition, and this is true also of Eastern thought generally as a whole. You see this in Eastern Orthodox theology. It's also in Aquinas and Augustine. When they talk about God, it's called apophatic theology, and apophasis means through negation. And we can see then this trend here in Socrates of there's a sort of a paradoxical way that we come to know, and it's by unknowing, right? And that doesn't mean like you sit and try to forget everything. It means that you go through this process of realizing that you don't know. Okay, so in philosophy, there's a degree of humility that's involved in beginning the process, even though most of the time people tend to think of philosophers as arrogant, and we philosophers can be very arrogant. Maybe we come to know and we don't actually know, but we think we know. Regardless, the process that the apology lays out is the process of thinking through what you've been given. Okay, so, like myself, growing up in a small town, most people in this small town just did whatever they were raised to do. Okay, so if you were raised Baptist, well, you're just Baptist. It never occurred to many of them to ever question, well, maybe the Baptist faith isn't true. You grow up in China and you believe communism or Confucianism. You're just kind of raised with that. It never occurs to most people, I don't think, to reflect and say, well, why do I believe these things? Maybe they're not true. And I think we see it in our own day that there's a lot of people who maybe they do now question their religious upbringing, whatever it might be, which can be a good thing. That can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. It's not always necessarily good, because a lot of times people just follow trends, right? So they, the new atheism, that's the trend. They'll follow that not because of any serious reflection, but because it's kind of popular now, or becoming popular. And I think if you atheists out there that are listening to this, I think you would probably agree. Apart from the question of whether theism is true or not, it does seem to be the case that a lot of times people go along with stuff just because it's going along with the herd or the crowd. So Platonism and the idea that Socrates is outlining here for the life of the philosopher is very much opposed to going along with the crowd, right? So we can see perhaps a nascent form of the rise of the individual, or the great man, or something like that, from Evola, Julius Evola, or A Man Against Time, or something like that, or that idea of Western thought that the individual can accomplish things through his own questioning, through his own reason and rationality. And certainly there's something true to that, true with that. And we see, for whatever good points Eastern and Western civilizations have had in contrast to one another, one good point about the West is that we have had a tendency to do amazing things because of the understanding of the creative and genius abilities or potentials of the individual, as opposed to completely collectivist thinking, right? So I don't want to, again, I'm not trying to put us into a dialectic here where we set the individual as the only thing that matters over against, absolute collectivism or something like that. Those are two sides of a dialectical coin. So we want to avoid that. But we can see in the history of East and West this interesting fact about the West. The amazing advances in technology and so forth that are a kind of a Faustian bargain that Mark Haggard and I talked about in our interview. Nevertheless, the individual can achieve great things, and that is kind of a Platonic, Socratic idea that there's an objective standard of what's right and wrong, true and false, what exists and what doesn't exist, right? Knowledge, ethics, metaphysics. And everyone has to submit to that. And so that the presupposition, if you will, of the philosopher, in the case of Socrates, is that there's a truth higher than, socially accepted opinions or state-approved opinions. Right and wrong, absolute goodness, these things are above the state. Reason, logic, these are things that everybody has to submit to, whether they want to or not. And if they choose not to, ultimately it's to their own detriment. So when he goes to the oracle at Delphi, the oracle tells him that he's the wisest man because he realized in humility that he didn't know. So the paradox here is that the humility of taking the track of questioning and not assuming that you're right just because you were raised to do something or trained to do something. That's kind of the hallmark of the beginning of the philosopher. So he says that in his defense that he can't be accused of inciting the youth and so on, and excuse me, teaching atheism, because he was never after any of the brutish, crude trappings that his interlocutors accused him of. Since he doesn't have any money, clearly he wasn't, out for greedy power and gain. Now there's a bit of a contradiction because Socrates does think he's appointed by God. He sees himself as kind of in a prophetic role. We know from the Timaeus that he received a religious initiation from the priests of Egypt that Solon, I believe, passed on to Socrates. Solon had gone to Egypt and sojourned there and learned the mysteries of Egypt, and then passed that on to Socrates, who in turn passes it on to Plato. So Plato and Socrates are fundamentally religious thinkers. So we don't have to adopt all these religious opinions in Platonism, but it's not a secular thinking. However, because it does promote reason, there's been a long tendency amongst rationalists and secularists to lionize or utilize Platonism for the purpose of sort of a nascent form of secularism. And there is a basis there for that. The secular republic that would be the ideal of the French revolutionaries or any kind of communist revolutionary. They're ultimately republicans, generally speaking. Their idea of the secular republic does come from Plato. So it's there, but it's not fully consistently worked out, right? So is all religion the noble lie? We don't know. I mean, there's kind of a two-pronged presentation in Plato, and scholars, for a long time have argued to what extent the gods are real or not real or whatever, or just humanized anthropomorphic images of, say, principles in nature, like what we see with Egypt. But regardless, in his defense, at least, Socrates says, I believe I'm appointed by God. I have dreams and visions. My daemon, not demon, but daemon, guardian spirit, he says, has been leading me all along. And my guardian angel or spirit, gives me, impels me to do the things that I do. So he says, I am appointed by God to do these things. Now, whether or not you heed, my ideas and teachings, that's up to you. And if you don't, it's to your own detriment. So you can get rid of me, but it's only going to be worse for you in the long run to do that. So he says, to his interlocutors, he says, none of you care about the youth. You accuse me of corrupting the youth. He says, none of you, it's never even entered into your mind to care about what the youth thought or did. He said, so, that I go around teaching and really just questioning people's views. He said, that's no cause for putting me to death. He talks about, he says, if I'm a bad guy, like you say, if I'm a bad apple, a rotten Greek apple, he said, don't you think that I would have a rotten effect? He says, so, the bad tends to bring about more bad. The good tends to bring about more good. We can think about, say, Sermon on the Mount, good tree bears good fruit, bad tree bears bad fruit. You'll know them by the fruit. That's kind of what Socrates is saying here. He says, where's all the bad fruit that you're talking about? Where's all the corruption and the dissolution that's a result of, my revolutionary ideas? He says, you're not going to find it. He then says, because you call me an atheist because I sat under Anaxagoras, who was a, empirical, natural, scientific type Greek philosopher. Natural science is what he followed. And we know from the Phaedo that Socrates gives a brilliant essentialist refutation of that view of the world, as I mentioned in the other talk. And so here he's referring back to Anaxagoras and saying, you think that because I sat under that guy that, I'm teaching the same atheism. He says, you're not trying that guy, you're trying me. He says, and I don't believe those things. So he says, how can I be, again, he It says, how can I be teaching new gods and at the same time teaching atheism? He says, what you want me to do is quit philosophizing, basically. And he says, you're all just basically resorting to slander and jealousy. He says, if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. There is an Obi-Wan quote here. It's very reminiscent of Obi-Wan Kenobi in section 30, C and D, where he says basically that I'm appointed as the prophet of this city. So it's a very, very profound, strong claim he makes there, right? So again, not a treatise where he believes that he's promoting relativism, but a treatise where he sees himself on a divine mission to, enlighten the population of Athens. And he says, if you strike me down, it'll be a lot worse for you. But that also, though, see that if we're to take Socrates at his word, we can't really have this totally atheistic reading. It's very difficult to force that into it because if he's just playing them, gaming them, then he's not telling the truth, right? But ultimately, Socrates will submit to the decision of the council to go to his own death, to be put to death, precisely because he doesn't think that the philosopher can or should lie. Lying and deceiving would be doing a wrong, even if for the sake of a good, one's doing a wrong. Socrates believes you can't do that. And then in the next dialogue, Crito, that's the very topic that comes up, because Crito says, "Come on, man, let's escape. Let's get out of here. You don't have to die. We can get you out of here. We've formed an escape plan." And he says, "No." He says, "It's never wrong, or it's never right for me to do what's wrong, even in the case of doing a good." So, in other words, if we were to try to read this as a purely secular, atheistic approach on the part of Socrates, then he would be a fork-tongued, double-minded liar, because he would be espousing, prophetic, a prophetic office, belief in a divine mission from God, belief in guardian spirits, belief in afterlife, higher dimensions, all these things, and none of it would be true, right? So that would kind of defeat the whole purpose of everything that this is all about, right? Having one's attention and gaze focused on the true, the good, the beautiful, the upright. So that's why the secular atheist reading of all this and rationalist reading of this doesn't work. And he talks again about divine oracles and dreams. He says, I keep having these dreams telling me what to do. Giving me an impetus to teach philosophy. He says, I have to obey that. So that would be more wrong. It would be wrong. It would be more wronger for me to obey men than God. Again, similar ideas that we see in the biblical books, the Old Testament texts, stuff that we see, say in the book of Acts, St. Paul. So, great quote here. He says, I've never lived an ordinary life. I did not care for the things that most people cared about: making money, having a comfortable home, high military or civil rank, and all the other activities, political appointments, secret societies, party organizations which go on in our city. I thought that I was really too strict in my principles to survive if I went for that sort of thing. So instead of taking a course which would have done no good either to you or to me, I set myself to do you individually in private what I hold to be the greatest possible service. I try to persuade each one of you to think not of practical advantages merely, but of his mental and moral well-being. And that's kind of the point here, is that the goal of the philosopher, Socrates thinks, should be ultimately to enlighten, lift up, raise mankind, to aid and to help, to be of service. It's not a destructive enterprise. At least it shouldn't be. True philosophy shouldn't be. And he says, if I run away, then it shows that, or if I try to, mitigate the sentence and make it a fine or something like that instead of death, he says, then it shows that I fear death. He says, but my whole philosophy has been geared towards not fearing death. So we see a profound kind of logic and wisdom at work here, that, he kind of, it's almost like he knew that if he went to his death and faced it fearlessly, it would vindicate the philosophical tradition that he's advocating. If he ran away, if he escaped, his buddies argue with him later in the next dialogue, Crito, and they say, well, you could do better, you could do much more good if you're still alive. He says, no, look, this is a key, crucial, pivotal point in my life, that if I flee from death, then I fear death. And that kind of destroys the whole project, right? It means that all the stuff I'm saying is one thing, but it's not really what I believe, right? So it would evidence hypocrisy on his part. And he says, I'm not afraid to lose life, right? And we know from the discussion that I did on Phaedo, when we read Phaedo, there's an extended talk of why he doesn't fear death. He says, well, because the soul's immortal, I'm going to live on in the next life. And he says, I think I've lived uprightly, and if that's the case, then I shouldn't fear death, right? So the only people who fear death, he seems to say, are those who've lived wrongly. And the unexamined life is not worth living. Again, that's one of the more perennial quotes of philosophy. That's kind of if we were to pick a single motto, if we had a blog that was just philosophy, and we had one tagline for the blog that described all of philosophy, it would be, the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's the beginning of philosophy. He says that in the afterlife, I look forward to talking to the dead. I look forward to meeting Orpheus and Hesiod and Homer and Odysseus and all these great souls of our tradition. He says, so why would I fear that? He says, I can learn from them a lot more than any of the earthly men are going to be able to teach me. So putting me to death, he says, basically just puts me in a better position. Doesn't really do me any harm. So that concludes the dialogue of the apology, Socrates' defense before the tribunal. And this, by the way, is where we get the term apologetics. An apology is a defense, not a saying I'm sorry. It's a defense for one's views, one's belief, one's thought, one's worldview. And this is, again, there's a primacy to objective logic, reason, rationality, that is one of the key positive aspects of Western thought. If we were to say, transport back to 5,000 years ago and say China, I'm not knocking positive aspects of ancient Eastern civilizations, but my understanding is there's not in ancient Eastern thought, Far Eastern thought, the idea of objective principles that everyone's kind of bound to, right? So if the emperor says something's law and says something's the case, well, you've got to do it whether you believe that's true or false, right? You're going to lose your head or something worse. So that the idea that the state makes logic, the state makes reality. We have the birth in Western thought of the idea that that's not true. Even though Socrates does submit to the ruling of the state that he must go to death, the nascent principle here, the principle that will develop for the rest of the history of the West, is that there's a standard outside of man's laws and man's rulings that man must submit to, right? A law above man. And why does he think this? Well, because again, this is a tradition connected with Pythagoreanism. Pythagoreanism, very, very key to understanding the esoteric tradition, true esotericism, understands that in the objective world there are metaphysical, mathematical, geometrical principles at work, and they're not dependent on, human social construction. The human mind doesn't construct geometric principles. They are, objectively. And so, again, that suggests a higher logical, rational, objective, whatever, order that exists in the world or in the mind of God, etc., that we as individual humans ultimately have to submit to. We don't have the ability to make 2 + 2 = 5. We don't have the ability to, reverse geometric principles in nature and make them not the case. Okay? So, objective principles that all men are subject to. This is one of the great crucial points that comes out of Platonism, and that would be a defining principle in the history of Western thought. That's a positive aspect, right? The Chinese emperor, can't just come and say 2 + 2 = 5, because I'm the God emperor. No, there's a law outside of you, above you, that you must submit to. Now, you may not. The Chinese emperor may choose to rule that for all of the kingdom 2 + 2 = 5, but he will quickly learn that his economic policies will not fare well in the empire when everyone tries to work on the principle of 2 + 2 = 5. The imperial coffers may not hold their gold very long with such principles. So, and this is very similar to, the biblical tradition as well. We look at, like I said in the last discussion, the possibility of interplay between the teaching of Moses, the teaching that's in the Torah, that the Jews had in Egypt, and the interplay with the Egyptian court and Egyptian theology and mysteries, and then what comes down to Plato through Solon and Socrates, according to the Timaeus. So if that's true, if that tradition is true, then we can see parallels. We can see, because Moses says to Pharaoh, right, you're not God. You can't make reality true or false. You can't make, XYZ not be the case when XYZ is the case. Similar ideas, right? From Moses to Plato, the idea of there being objective principles, whether in thought, whether in reality, metaphysics, or whether in ethics, etc. Man, in his futility, cannot reverse what is. So that concludes the discussion on the apology, and I want to thank listeners if you've made it this far through my droning. I did gain some subscribers, paid subscribers this week with the Phaedo talk, so that was really good. That was a positive thing. And I want to thank those guys. You guys will be getting this first. I'll wait a little while, a few days before putting it up for anybody else's for free. And you're really doing, I think, a good thing here. You're helping me out. You're supporting the advance of philosophy. You're supporting the advance of, even if you don't agree with all the stuff I say, this is still a good way to get the basics of what's going on in the apology. So, for $4.95, like I say, you can avoid, the professor standing up there telling you what it means for, $1,500 a credit hour. For $4.95, you can get, a better discussion, I believe, for a minuscule fraction of that price. So thank you for the paid subscribers, and tell your friends. Right, this is a good thing. What Jay's analysis tries to do is look at pop culture, look at film, look at literature, look at the classics, and get a deeper sense for what's going on out there in the world. Even if you disagree with all the stuff I talk about, I'm at least trying to get people to think, right? So what's wrong with that? Trying to get you to do what Socrates has done, and that's kind of the course I've taken in my life. Whether successful or not, I don't know. I guess that remains to be seen. But the apology had a profound effect on me in my youth, 18, 19, 20, 21, going into college, to think for yourself, to question what's going on in the world, question why you believe what you believe. Maybe you'll come to the conclusion that, what you were brought up with or what you've always believed is correct, right? So there should be no fear in these things, and I think a lot of times people are motivated by fear to not challenge their assumptions, challenge their beliefs. But ultimately, in the long run, for you and for everyone else, I think challenging your views, challenging your beliefs, considering other options, that's really what will cause you as a human being to flourish, to grow, to progress. So tell your friends, and if you like what you hear, when this goes up for everybody, help me out here. Let's get to where I can do this full time, and we'll go through all of Plato's dialogues. And like I said, in a couple months you could have a knowledge of every work of Plato, 1,500 pages, right? Can't beat that for a few bucks. That's crazy, right? And that's better. Granted, it'd be great if you wanted to go and read it on your own, but most people don't have the time to, read 1,500 pages of Platonic dialogues. And at the same time, they're pretty difficult in places. There's a lot of abstruse metaphysical concepts here. So that concludes the apology, and I think next what we'll do is Crito, and since Crito is pretty short, probably team it up with a few of the other shorter dialogues that, although they're small, contain a lot of really profound ideas. So I want to thank listeners, and check out jaysanalysis.com.